Have you ever noticed how some people lose everything and somehow end up richer than before? I'm not talking about lottery winners or trust fund kids. I'm talking about people who hit rock bottom, lost their business, filed for bankruptcy, got fired, and then 5 years later they're doing better than they ever did before the disaster. Meanwhile, other people experience the exact same setback and never recover. They spend decades trying to get back to where they were. Some never do. Here at Simple Money, we've spent years analyzing what separates these two groups. And what we found has nothing to do with luck, connections, or even intelligence. It's something way more interesting than that. Today, I'm going to show you the exact system wealthy people use to turn their biggest failures into their most valuable assets. And I'm going to warn you right now. This goes against everything you've been taught about success. Here's what's really happening when wealthy people fail. Most of us have been taught that failure is something to avoid at all costs, something to hide, something that marks you as less capable, less worthy, less successful. We see failure as a permanent stain on our record. But wealthy people? They see failure completely differently. To them, failure isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. It's expected. It's actually part of their strategy. Think about it this way. Imagine you're learning to ride a bike. You fall down, scrape your knee. Do you think, well, I guess I'm just not a bike riding person? No, you think, okay, I learned that if I lean too far left, I fall. That failure just gave you data. Now imagine you're trying to build wealth, or start a business, or change careers. You try something. It doesn't work. But instead of seeing it as data, you see it as proof that you're not cut out for success. You see it as a character flaw, a permanent limitation. That's the trap most people fall into, and it keeps them stuck in the exact same place for decades. The wealthy understand something crucial. Every failure contains expensive information that other people paid for with their time, money, and energy. And if you know how to extract it, failure becomes the most valuable education you can get. But here's what makes this even more interesting. It's not just about learning from failure. It's about how wealthy people systematically turn those lessons into competitive advantages, into actual assets they can use to make money. Let me show you exactly how they do it. The first thing wealthy people do is something I call the failure audit. And this is where most people mess up right from the start. When something goes wrong, most people do one of two things. They either beat themselves up and spiral into shame, or they immediately jump to the next thing, trying to forget the failure ever happened. Both responses are completely natural, both feel protective, and both prevent you from extracting the value. Here's what the failure audit actually looks like. The moment something fails, wealthy people sit down and ask 3 specific questions. Not in a harsh way, not in a judgmental way, just factually. Question 1. What exactly happened? Not the story you tell yourself. Not the emotionally charged version. Just the facts. I launched this product, I invested this amount, I hired this person, this specific result occurred. Question 2. What were the decisions that led to this outcome? Not just the final decision. All of them. The decision to wait, the decision to rush, the decision to trust that person, the decision to ignore that warning sign. Write them all down. Question 3. What information did I lack that, if I had known it, would have changed my decision? This is the gold. This is the expensive lesson that just got handed to you. Most people never ask these questions. They just feel bad and move on. Or they blame external factors and learn nothing. The wealthy treat every failure like a crime scene investigation. Neutral, curious, focused on gathering intelligence. Let me give you a concrete example. Say you started a side business, put in $8,000, 6 months of work, and it completely flopped. 0 revenue. Most people think, I guess I'm not cut out for entrepreneurship. I wasted $8,000 and half a year. I'm such an idiot. And then they never try again. Someone doing a failure audit asks different questions. What exactly happened? I built a product nobody wanted. How do I know? I talked to 5 people who all said it sounded cool, but when I launched, nobody bought. What decisions led here? I built the entire product before testing if anyone would actually pay for it. I asked friends for feedback instead of potential customers. I assumed that because I would buy it, others would too. What information did I lack? I didn't know that positive feedback and actual purchase behavior are completely different things. I didn't know how to validate demand before investing time and money. I didn't know the difference between a nice idea and a viable business. See the difference? One response leaves you feeling worthless. The other response leaves you with a list of specific things you now know that you didn't know before. That's not a wasted $8,000. That's an $8,000 education that you can use forever. But here's where wealthy people take it to the next level. They don't just learn from the failure, they turn it into an actual asset. The second thing wealthy people do is what I call failure documentation. This sounds boring, but trust me, this is where the magic happens. Once they've done the failure audit, they write it down, not just notes, a detailed breakdown of what happened, what they learned, and what they'd do differently. Some people keep failure journals. Some create what they call loss reports, like a business would create an earnings report. Here's why this matters. Your brain is designed to protect you from painful memories. It's a survival mechanism. Over time, the sharp lessons from failure start to blur. The embarrassment fades, and 6 months later, you might make the exact same mistake again because you didn't preserve the lesson. But when you write it down, something interesting happens. That failure becomes a reference document, a playbook. And here's the thing. That playbook has enormous value. Think about how much people pay for business courses, coaching programs, consulting. They're paying for someone else's experience, someone else's failures, someone who already made the mistakes and can help them avoid those same mistakes. When you document your failures, you're creating your own consulting playbook for free, written specifically for your situation, in your industry, for your exact circumstances. But it gets better. This is where wealthy people really separate themselves. They share these failures publicly, strategically. I know that sounds insane. Why would you tell people about your failures? Doesn't that hurt your credibility? Here's what actually happens. When you share what you learned from a specific failure, especially in professional contexts, something counterintuitive occurs. People see you as more credible, not less. Why? Because you have actual experience. You've been in the arena. You've paid tuition at the school of hard knocks. You have wisdom that can't be found in textbooks. Wealthy people turn their documented failures into content, into advice, into consulting offers, into credibility. They'll write blog posts titled, "The $20,000 Mistake That Taught Me About Customer Acquisition." They'll give talks about what they learned from a failed business. They'll mentor others specifically because they know what doesn't work. Your failures, when properly documented and shared, become social proof that you've done the work, that you're not just theorizing, that you've actually tried things and learned from them. But here's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. This only works if you take full ownership. The third principle is something I call ruthless responsibility. And this is where things get psychologically difficult. When something fails, our brains immediately start looking for external explanations. The market crashed, my business partner screwed up, the algorithm changed, the economy shifted, customers are stupid. And yes, sometimes external factors genuinely contribute to failure. But here's what wealthy people understand. Even when external factors exist, they focus exclusively on what they could have controlled. Why? Because that's where the power is. If your failure was caused by external factors you couldn't control, there's no lesson to extract. You were just unlucky. That failure has no value. But if you can identify even one thing you could have done differently, even one decision you made that contributed to the outcome, now you have something. Let me be clear. This isn't about shame or self-blame. It's about power. When you identify the decisions you made, you're identifying variables you can control next time. You're extracting the actual lesson. Most people do the opposite. They emphasize all the external factors specifically because it makes them feel better. It protects their ego, and in doing so, they throw away the most valuable part of the failure, the part that could actually help them succeed next time. Here's a real pattern I see constantly. Two people start businesses in the same industry, same year, similar budgets. Both businesses fail within 2 years. Person A says, "The market wasn't ready. My competitors undercut me on price. It was bad timing with the recession. I had terrible luck with my first few hires." Person B says, "I didn't validate demand before building. I competed on price instead of differentiation. I should have cut my burn rate 6 months earlier. I hired too quickly without proper vetting." Both businesses failed. But only person B extracted any value from that failure. Only person B now knows specific things to do differently next time. Person A will likely make similar mistakes if they try again, because they didn't take ownership of the decisions that led to the outcome. Ruthless responsibility isn't about being hard on yourself. It's about being honest about where you had agency, where you made choices, because those are the inflection points where your future self can choose differently. Now here's where this gets really interesting. Once you've audited the failure, documented it, and taken ownership, wealthy people do something that seems completely backwards. The fourth strategy is what I call strategic replication. They intentionally fail again, but in a controlled way. Let me explain. Most people experience a big failure and become terrified of failing again. They become conservative, risk-averse. They play it safe, which makes sense emotionally, but it's actually the worst response strategically. Here's why. That failure you just experienced, you paid full price for it. Time, money, emotion, opportunity cost. The absolute worst thing you can do is pay that price and then never use what you learned. That's like buying an $8,000 course and never implementing any of it. Wealthy people do the opposite. Once they've extracted the lessons from a failure, they actively look for opportunities to test those lessons, to apply them in a new context. And here's the key. They do it small. They don't bet everything on one big attempt. They run small experiments, low-stakes tests. They're essentially asking, did I actually learn the right lesson, or did I misinterpret what went wrong? And the only way to know is to try again with your new knowledge. This is what separates people who have one failure and never recover versus people who have multiple failures and end up wealthy. The second group isn't avoiding failure. They're getting better at it. Each iteration costs less and teaches more. Think about it like this. Imagine you're learning to shoot a basketball. You take a shot, it bounces off the rim. Now you have two choices. Never shoot again, or adjust your aim and shoot again immediately while the feedback is fresh. Obviously, you shoot again. But when it comes to business or investing or career moves, people act like one miss means they should never shoot again. That's insane. The wealthy keep shooting, but they adjust based on what they learned from the last miss. Let me give you a concrete example. Say you tried to start a service business. You spent 6 months building a website, creating service packages, writing proposals. You reached out to 50 potential clients, got 3 meetings, 0 sales. Business failed. Most people would either give up entirely or take years before trying something entrepreneurial again. Strategic replication looks different. Within weeks of that failure, you might start a different, smaller test. Maybe you post one specific service on a freelance platform. Spend 20 hours instead of 6 months. See if anyone bites. Or you reach out to 10 potential clients, but this time you pitch a different angle based on what you learned from those 3 meetings that went nowhere. Small bet, quick feedback, you're testing your new hypothesis immediately. This is how wealthy people turn one expensive failure into multiple cheap learning experiences. They're not being reckless. They're being scientific. Each small test either validates what they learned or teaches them something new, and each one costs a fraction of the original failure. But there's one more layer to this that most people never consider. The fifth and final strategy is something I call failure portfolios. This is advanced level, but it's how wealthy people actually think about risk. Most people try to avoid all failure. Their goal is 100% success rate. Wealthy people know that's impossible and, more importantly, suboptimal. Instead, they build a portfolio approach to risk. Some things will fail. That's expected. That's built into the plan. The question isn't whether you'll have failures. It's whether your overall portfolio of attempts produces a net positive outcome. Let me make this concrete. Imagine you have $10,000 to invest in your own growth. Could be business ideas, could be education, could be skill development. Most people would spend years researching the one perfect thing, then put all $10,000 into that one bet. And if it fails, they're devastated. Someone with a failure portfolio approach thinks completely differently. They might split that into 5 $2,000 bets, or 10 $1,000 bets. They're explicitly expecting that some will fail, but they only need 1 or 2 to succeed for the overall portfolio to be profitable. This completely changes your relationship with failure. You're not trying to avoid it, you're managing it. Each failure in the portfolio isn't a catastrophe. It's data. It's expected. It's fine, as long as the overall portfolio performs. Here's what's wild about this approach. People who try one big thing and fail feel like failures. People who try 10 small things and 7 fail feel like they're succeeding because 3 things worked. Same number of failures, completely different psychology, completely different outcomes. And here's the secret. Those 3 successes often cover the cost of all 7 failures and then some. But you had to be willing to have those 7 failures to find the 3 successes. Most people never give themselves permission to fail 7 times, so they never get to experience those 3 wins. Wealthy people know that if you're not failing regularly, you're not trying enough things. You're playing too safe. You're leaving money on the table. They'd rather have a batting average of 3 out of 10 if those 3 wins are big enough, than a perfect record of small, safe bets. But here's where this gets really deep. Here's what nobody wants to admit. Failure only becomes an asset if you survive it. And that means you need to structure your life so that failures can't destroy you. This is the part people ignore when they romanticize wealthy people bouncing back from failure. Those people had something most people don't. A safety net. They had savings. They had relationships they could fall back on. They had skills that were still valuable even if their business failed. They had a way to pay rent while they figured out the next move. When wealthy people say they lost everything, they often mean they lost their business equity or their fancy lifestyle. Not that they were homeless. This is crucial. You can't extract value from failure if you're in survival mode. You can't do a failure audit if you're scrambling to feed your kids. You can't experiment with strategic replication if one more failure means eviction. The wealthy can turn failures into assets, partly because they structured their lives to be resilient to failure. So before you go out and embrace failure, you need to build that foundation. Emergency fund, marketable skills, multiple income sources, relationships, a plan B. That's not sexy advice. It's not exciting, but it's the difference between failure being a learning experience and failure being a disaster you never recover from. Let me tell you about 2 people. We'll call them Marcus and Lisa. Both lost their jobs in the same month at the same company. Both were in their early 30s. Both had been there for 5 years. Both got 3 months severance. Marcus had been living paycheck to paycheck. Nice apartment, new car, subscriptions to everything. He had about $2,000 in savings when he got laid off. The job loss felt like a catastrophe. He immediately went into panic mode. Applied to everything. Took the first offer he got, even though it paid less than his old job. He needed income yesterday. 1 year later, Marcus is back to where he started. Same type of role, similar company. He's still stressed about money, still living paycheck to paycheck. The layoff was just a scary blip that he's trying to forget. He learned nothing from it because he didn't have the breathing room to learn anything. Now Lisa. She had been saving aggressively. She had 8 months of expenses in the bank. She also had been freelancing on the side for 2 years. Not making much, but she had clients and a reputation. When she got laid off, she was obviously stressed. But not desperate. Lisa spent the first week just processing. Then she did a failure audit, not just about the layoff, but about her entire career trajectory. She realized she'd been climbing a ladder she didn't even want to be on. The corporate job felt safe, but she'd been miserable for 2 years. She asked herself, what would I do if I wasn't afraid of failing? She spent the next 2 months testing. She ramped up her freelancing, reached out to old clients, pitched new ones. Some said no, some said yes. She also applied to jobs, but selectively. Only roles she actually wanted. She treated the layoff like an experiment. What if this wasn't a setback? What if this was an opportunity to finally try that thing she'd been too scared to try? 6 months after the layoff, Lisa was making more from freelancing than she made at her corporate job. She eventually turned it into a full business. 3 years later, she's making double what she made before and works half the hours. The layoff, which seemed like a failure at the time, was the best thing that ever happened to her career. Here's the difference. It wasn't that Lisa was smarter or more talented. It's that she had built a foundation that let her treat the failure as data instead of disaster. She could afford to take her time, to experiment, to actually learn from what happened instead of just surviving it. Marcus might have had the exact same potential, but without that foundation, the layoff was just trauma, not education. He couldn't extract any value because he was too busy trying not to drown. This is what people miss when they study wealthy people who bounce back from failure. They're not just mentally tough or naturally resilient. They've structured their lives to be anti-fragile, to benefit from shocks and setbacks. And you can do that too, but it requires building that foundation first. Here's the reframe that changes everything. Failure isn't the opposite of success. It's a step in the process of success. But only if you know how to process it. Most people think success looks like a straight line upward. You try something, it works. You level up, you try something bigger, it works. You keep climbing. And when that doesn't happen, when there are setbacks and failures and things that don't work, they think something's wrong. They think they're doing it wrong. They think they're not cut out for this. But wealthy people know that success actually looks like a squiggly line. Up, down, sideways, up again, down again. Big spike up. The failures aren't deviations from the path. They are the path. Each failure is a course correction, a data point, a stepping stone that only looks like a step back until you can see the whole journey. The difference isn't whether you fail. It's whether you have a system for turning those failures into assets. The failure audit to extract the lessons. Failure documentation to preserve the wisdom. Ruthless responsibility to identify what you can control. Strategic replication to test what you learned. And failure portfolios to manage risk systematically. These aren't just nice frameworks. They're the actual difference between people who fail and give up, and people who fail and end up wealthy. One group sees failure as evidence they should quit. The other group sees it as expensive information they just paid for. And they make damn sure they get their money's worth. So here's my question for you. How many failures have you paid for that you never extracted any value from? How many times did something not work and you just felt bad about it and moved on? How much have you spent on education you never used? Because here's the truth. You're going to fail. That's not pessimistic. That's just math. If you're trying anything worthwhile, failure is part of the deal. The only question is whether those failures make you stronger or just make you quit. Whether they become assets or just regrets. The wealthy didn't figure out how to avoid failure. They figured out how to profit from it. And now you know how they do it.